Hi everyone, in this video I'm gonna give you JavaScript pro tips and techniques that you can just master in order to take your skills into the next level. So in this video it's just gonna be all about JavaScript, and it's gonna be more like should do and should don'ts kind of tips. So do's and don'ts kind of tips. If you know this kind of video tutorials where it's just like, it give you like what you should do on JavaScript and what you should avoid doing as of 2021 and as of the latest whatever next version it is from JavaScript is available, and as of like ES6, that is the revolutionary JavaScript version that is, made a lot of changes to the JavaScript world, how developers think about code, and how JavaScript can execute on the browser in different ways. So that's what I'm going to be giving you actually today's guys for like JavaScript pro tips and what kind of tips that you should get into to master. So I'm going to go do it. As close in here, I got like a basic project that is set up, and it's all about just like JavaScript and HTML5 projects with some CSS. So this is just a basic project, and it's actually I've used some generator to use and put that project. And actually the first step onto that is actually always like as of 2021, you should start using a CLI generator or a boilerplate ready-made for you, has all the code ready-made for you guys, and has everything, best practices, design patterns, has, many like files into it, many configuration files exclusive on that particular project. It has already made up some pages, some CSS files, and it does even have some like, standard CSS files that is, going to work across multiple browsers, and it's going to make the most out of it. So it's going to make your code, your website, your application much more like, supported across different browsers, and has like more capability of handling CSS and styles in a standard way. So yeah, always think about using this one. And I'm using here, as you can see, a boilerplate, and this boilerplate called HTML5 boilerplate. So you can go and check it out on GitHub here. So HTML5 boilerplate, or H5BP. And it's pretty basic boilerplate actually. It has all of that files. You can just directly go ahead and clone that, but I don't really recommend. You can go download this zip file. I don't recommend either. What I recommend doing is going to like npx, create HTML5 boilerplate, then go like new site and cd into it and install npm, as you pretty much do in any project. If you're familiar with React, anything kind of stuff. So just like you set up an npm project, you install the dependencies on it, and boom, you are ready to go and ready to get started with the project. So that's basically what it is in here, and it has actually a lot of support, a lot of stuff, and the number of stars are ridiculous, but as you can see in here. So that is actually a good sign for you guys. Just leap into this and start using something like this instead of just like starting from the ground up, start to setting up everything from the ground up. And plus this one, it uses Parcel, and Parcel is actually a bundler. It's something like Webpack that allows you to use, like new technologies, like new syntax, like ES7, ES8 syntax from JavaScript, and all the new features of like the ESNext of JavaScript. And just like you use it, then it transpile it into, like whatever is supported by all browsers, like ES4 or ES5 or something like that. And basically it allows you to bundle all of your stuff, like with images, SVG files, JSON files, CSS, even allows you to use Sass and all of that kind of stuff. So that's why it's called a bundler, and it's really, really helpful to use it as of 2021. I do really recommend going ahead and just like using that, because you won't regret it, and it's going to make your life much easier. You're going to feel yourself in the future already. And yeah, so this one is definitely worth it. Just go ahead and jump right into it. The second pro tip that everybody actually, in my opinion, should start using in JavaScript, in whatever other language you're actually working on. It just pretty much has to exist everywhere, and everybody, like every single programmer, developer, coder, whatever you call yourself, should start using that particular thing, the immutability. And that is actually a really, really big thing. I know a lot of people just hear about that, so it doesn't exactly know what immutable objects are. What is, mutable versus immutable objects? What does that mean? Which one is, better than one? And just like they can intend to like ignore that kind of stuff and just like, say, nah, I don't need that. But it really, really matters, because I try to work with mutable objects versus immutable objects, and it makes a lot of sense. and it just gives a lot more logic into using immutability versus mutable objects. So this tip is more about like how you should start using immutable objects and what mutable objects, like the regular mutable JavaScript kind of arrays and objects, what can those introduce as bugs and like unexpected exceptions and expected behaviors of your application, of how the code should be executed. So that's what I'm gonna just like see in here. So as clear in here, got should do and should not do. I'm always gonna start with should not do. I got pretty self-explanatory source code with there. I'm gonna execute it here and I'm gonna see exactly what's going on. So as clear in here for should not do, and you should completely avoid that in many cases. So excluding here, what we got a simple function called map. So this function, what it takes an array and it takes an f. This f is just like a callback function that you can pass it through. And here it loops through all the elements of the array. So it does I0, I less than length, I plus plus. Then it does array I equals f of array I. So whatever function you're passing in here is going to pass that particular value of the array to that function, and it's going to return it and set it into that array. And that line of code itself is kind of like a big deal, you know what I mean? It's going to do like a lot of mutation in here, and it's going to mutate a lot. And the bad stuff, or like pretty much the worst thing I'm doing right here is actually, or the code is actually having, is we are actually taking this argument, which is an array, and as we all familiar, arrays on JavaScript are reference, which means are passed in by reference. They're not creating a copy. So for example, if you're passing an array in here, let's say this particular array, I'm going to pass it through to this function. This array is going to be the same one as this one. It's not going to copy it, like create a new copy of it. No, it's just going to basically copy the memory, the pointer to that memory, if you're familiar with, low level languages. But basically what it does is going to reference that particular array on memory. It's going to use it the same one in here. So whatever change you're going to put inside of this array, this one is going to be affected. And this is kind of bad. And you won't expect that behavior because you say, oh, I'm passing this one. This is a completely new variable, completely separate from this one. I shouldn't care about it, right? But that one is going to is going to pollute the outer scope, which is this one. And it's going to make things much harder to read. So let's just continue going through the code, and here we eventually return the array. So we just put everything back into the array of I. So we are replacing whatever values we got in here, and we just basically use that function to replace whatever values in there. And here we got excess, which is just our basic array in here. We got old excess, which is another array. They are pretty much identical. I just create this old excess just to make a point. I'm console logging it afterwards. Now for the new excess in here, what I'm basically doing is I'm using this map function. I'm passing in the actual array, which is this particular one, which has from 1 to 5 as strings or as characters, and I'm passing parse in function. So remember, this one takes a function and it's going to use this function and it's passing it whatever value inside of the array, which means it's going to pass it every single time. It's going to pass it 1, so then it's going to pass it 2, then 3, then 4, then 5. And once this function is passed that, so parse in, what it basically does, screws in here, it parses an integer, it parses a string into an integer, if it is a valid string, of course. So here if you pass it at 1 and it's actually a string type, it's going to just return to you 1 as a number type. That's what it basically is going to do, and that's what it's going to do right here. So we're passing parsing in here, it's going to just take it out there, and we got the excess in here, and this is the bad part. So we're passing it this excess, and remember, arrays are passed in by reference, which means this excess, this array are pretty much identical. They are the same. They just variable names point to the same piece of data and the same array on memory. So that's what's going to happen. Now, I did a console log in here, and this is basically the source code right here. You can just pass in this excess to another sum function that expects this excess to be this exact array, nothing else. We just expects this one to be, having array values from 1 to 5 as string. Then this new excess is going to have value from 1 to 5 as numbers. So this is what the code actually tells, right? So let's go ahead and see what actually the code does. So let me just go back right here. I'm going to open up the console, In fact, I'm gonna just go ahead and make that one readable. So let me just gonna import the code, and for should not do, yeah, mutable objects. Okay, so let's just jump. I'm gonna open up the console right there, and I'm gonna see what exactly it does. Now, clicks in here should not do. So for XS, what we got, like just by printing that out, and if we go back, we printed the XS, this particular array. We're calling the map here, we printed it here. How does it look like? If we go back, that doesn't look like an XS, right? That array has been mutated. That object has been mutated, and it has been changed from this particular version. This is why I'm naming it old XS. So it's being like renamed from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and those are actually strings into these numbers. And it is ridiculous. It just like completely mutated the array, and which is completely not expected. Now for new XS, what we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is expected. Pretty cool, right? So that's a really bad behavior of how arrays and objects and kind of like JavaScript, how it works by preference and all that, and why you should avoid using mutable objects versus using immutable objects. So that's basically what I'm saying in here. Let's go ahead and just jump into the second example, and with should do. So this is the best approach to approach this. And for that approach, I'm using Immutable library. So Immutable.js library is just like a library that provides you with all data sets of just like a regular JavaScript. So this list replaces pretty much arrays, there's objects, there's maps, there's all sort of stuff that you can find in Immutable.js. And every one of these like data structures are immutable. So you can't mutate those. They have functions and they have all kind of stuff that make it mutable, but they're actually immutable. And this is a pretty good approach, and that's why a lot of like companies, a lot of teams just like rely on this Immutable.js, because it really makes a lot of sense. Okay, now we have the same code in here. All we're doing pretty much, we're creating a new list which is from Immutable.js. And this one, we are actually creating a new list. We're not just going to mutate this array, and we're going to just like, we got in here array, and in fact, this array is actually a list, so you can't mutate it, whatever. I'm going to create a new list. We are looping through array, then we just like assign this new list, and here, whatever we push into it, then we're going to eventually return the new list, which is pretty self-explanatory, right? Now we got this one is actually a list. This one, it doesn't really matter. We can have a list or array, just like for debugging and just like exactly showing you a proof of concept kind of thingy. And we are using the map function here. We pass in a parse in, we pass in an XS, the same code as before. Now I'm just going to grab those. I'm just going to convert them to array because, you know, those are not arrays, those are lists. So I'm just going to do that for printing. Now let's go to here, and I'm just going to comment those. Let me see that. So if you go back here, and there you go. So for the should do, as expected, we got XS, 1, 2, 3, and those all are strings. They're not numbers as here. XS is actually originally a string array, right? Look at it. XS is in here, both they are string array from 1 to 5. Pretty self-explanatory, right? Now, the first bad code mutates that and makes it, you know, like whatever that function we passed into supposed to do, that what it's become, and became basically just numbers instead of strings. And the old XS, they're identical in here. If you compare, you're going to find them. It's true. And new XS is basically as expected. And this is the right code that you should follow, and it works as expected to be. So my advice in here, my pro tip is always, just basically always try to avoid using immutable objects and just go through using immutable objects whenever you could. It just like makes your lives easier. It makes the code looks much more, you know, readable and makes a lot of more sense. So you won't be afraid of reading a code and saying, oh, this could be immutable. Oh, is this immutable? Then you start over Stack Overflow and Googling stuff and all the kind of weird stuff that can happen to you. But just like using immutable, especially Immutable.js library, gonna make a lot of sense. Gonna make a lot of stuff looking good. You still can avoid Immutable.js library. You can use, you know, whatever JavaScript provides, like ESNext has pretty good methods to do so. But I still really recommend going with this library because it makes a lot more sense to go through. The third pro tip here are actually promises are awesome. And they are indeed. Promises are so beautiful. and it makes a lot of sense to use promises instead of like callback hell. And if you're not familiar with callback hell, well, you're actually kind of unique guy. And yeah, hopefully you won't actually know about callback hell. If you just like heard about this keyword, just ignore that. Go with promises. Don't think about it. But if you are actually one of the guys, one of the unique golden developers who just like been a lot through callback hell, like this nested, really long callback functions nested each other's, and they make a lot of no kind of sense just to read through that. So you're in the right place, and I'm just going to show you why promises are actually super good to use. So you're going to like just like them, then never try to lose them again, and just like use them every single day, like whenever you could. So for should not do in here, like what you should avoid for promises, and basically for the code in here what I got a couple of functions. This function is a prepare data. It's just like a stupid function. What it does, it takes a piece of data in here. It's going to be expected as an array, and it takes a callback, and this is the old-fashioned using callbacks. Okay, then it does a for loop, it grabs the index and the value, and it does a set timeout. And as we all familiar with set timeouts, it's actually an asynchronous function that's going to run after specified amount of time, specified amount of milliseconds in here. So 1,000 millisecond is going to run this particular function after 1,000 milliseconds is elapsed from the execution of that particular function. Pretty sweet, right? Now, what's going to happen behind the scenes in here is actually we're going to have this one. So I'm going to do like an if state, if index plus 1 equals data.length, which means if we are on the last iteration, like if we like pushed all the data, did the preparation, everything is good, all we have to do is just call the callback with the prepared data. Now, why I'm doing this, because this is an asynchronous code and we have to use callbacks, and you know, kind of like why callbacks are useful kind of thingy. So that's why we are putting it in that particular case scenario. Pretty cool. Now we got prepared data in here, we got length, and we got the callback. The second function we got use data, which takes data and it takes a callback, and it basically has a set timeout as well. We just calls the callback with some kind of message after 2 seconds. Pretty basic. And I have this just like for like proving a point of what exactly it does. Okay, now just go into the the core thingy that we should take care of. And here we got an XML HTTP request. And this one is actually going to allow us to do HTTP request, grab the data from whatever server it is, and just, process it. And as we all familiar with, grabbing data from a server, just like going outside of your local machine, sending a request on HTTP, this is asynchronous. You don't know when the response is going to come back. You don't know exactly what's the time it's going to take to come back to you. So in that particular case scenario, it's going to happen. So all of these are asynchronous, and we have to pass in like callbacks. Okay. Now this is a callback. We take already state change. We assign it to a function, and this function on itself is actually a callback, right? So this function is going to run whenever the request comes back. We check for ready state. So if like 200, the request is good and response is good. We do a prepare data. We pass in the data in here, and we just like create another function callback. Pretty sweet, right? Now we go into this, then we get the data after this is finished. It prepares all the data for us. It comes back to us, do console log, then we use data, message, then we just like go console log that particular data message. Another callback. And this is just a little tiny small callback hell for you guys to exactly see what I mean by that. Imagine 300 lines of code nested inside of each other's, going through this way, like each one is going inside of another nested callback function. How does that look like? How would you love to use that kind of code in your application, or just like even look at it and try to exactly debug that or read through it? Pretty awful, right? So what it means, this is what I mean by callbacks. And if we go to the browser real quick, let me refresh. For the should not do, exclusive asynchronous, takes a couple of seconds or milliseconds to come back for you. And this is actually the prepared data. After it prepares the data, it just like, console logs it, start using the data in here. Then after finish using the data, we print done successfully. Now, if you go ahead and like refresh that, started using the data, takes like 2 seconds to do that, which means everything is working as expected, everything is asynchronous, and everything uses callback. Now this code looks pretty fine, it looks pretty good, but the code itself, it's not really that readable, and it looks pretty ugly, pretty awful. Now this is the old callback way. Now let's go ahead and see our beloved promises. So if we go to the should do, just jump right into it here. We got prepare data, use data, pretty much the same functions we got from before. Now, instead of going through all of that, and instead of using XML HTTP request, now we're actually using Axios. So Axios is just like a third-party library that allows us to do like HTTP requests. It basically uses XML HTTP requests, but it wraps that API, it wraps the callback API, and it makes it work using promises. So this Axios, and it has a get, which means we're going to do a get HTTP request. Screws in here on the definition, it returns a promise, including, and this promise has inside the Axios response, which basically has the response's data. Pretty simple. Now this is the callback, and how callback is being used is actually you do then, which means you successfully got the response with no errors. Then you're going to get the response as a callback. You're still going to have callbacks, right? It's not going to end after this. But I mean, this is definitely much better just going through all of that with this kind of callbacks. And this is why you should use promises. And one change actually we did to that particular code. Now screws in here, we are actually returning a new promise instead of just going straight into it. Now we are returning a new promise with resolve and rejects. And for this particular promises, you got like a for loop, then you got the timeout, and eventually just like gonna pass in resolve. And remember, those such promises, so this particular first function it takes in here is actually the resolve function, which means you call this function whenever you want to like end up the promise and you say the promise went successfully. The second function, which is rejects, so you want to reject the function or reject the promise, which means you end the promise, but with the rejects, it means there is an error happened. Okay. Now here just, we wanted like success with the resolve. The same thing goes in there, promise, resolve, like we passed in that, we got done successfully and all the kind of stuff. Then we got response status equals 200. We prepare the data, we do that again. Then we do use the data, we do that again. It's not really that best thing kind of thingy. It might look still the same, right? It's not a big difference, but it makes a lot of difference to use promises than just callbacks, because there's a lot of APIs and the promise objects in here, like ESNext and JavaScript provides. There's a lot of stuff. You can create promises on the go in here with resolve. You can use all, which means you wait for like a bunch of promises, like 3, 5, like an array of promises to finish all of them at the same time. Then you can do whatever kind of thingy. Then you got raise, rejects, many stuff, and many APIs, many third-party libraries now supports promises, and basically just wraps all of their whole APIs using the promise API in here just to make it easier to work with. And this is what the code should look like. Now let me just go ahead and just main.js, and I'm gonna run this, and since those are asynchronous, so it should like run only one file once. And here we got like should do. It does the same thing. It does, prepare data, start using the data, then finish successfully, prints the same thing, does prepare the same data, but the code right now looks much better to read through. Who agrees? Yes, it does look better, and you should always use promises whenever you could, and just always avoid callbacks. The fourth JavaScript best tip, actually for me, is Async-Await. So if you ever heard about this keyword or already know about Async-Await, well, congratulations. You're actually one of the good people. But if you don't know what Async-Await, or you don't know where to use Async-Await and why it's useful, right? So you are in the right place, and we're going to see an example exactly makes sense of using Async-Await versus using callbacks, or just like, using the regular then catch of a promises. Now here for the should not do, we're just like basically we're having like, the previous prepared data like function, what it does, it returns promise, it prepares the data for us. Now the next one function in here, or basically the piece of code we are running, we got Axios get. We get that from particular API. Then we got then, return a response. We just like returning that particular data, then we can chain it up with another then. This is one of the other features that promises has, by the way. And we got prepared data in here, so we're going to prepare the data, we're going to do then and catch again. And it does look good. It's tidy and it's clean to look through. because we don't have a lot of code, right? And this code, just by looking at it, like the first glance, you're going to see this code isn't going to be looking like a synchronous code anywhere soon, right? It doesn't look like that. It looks asynchronous code, straight to the point, and you're just like going to see a lot of callbacks going through, a lot of then catch, and it might feel a little bit ugly. And if the code, grows and grows, you're going to just like have more difficulties debugging and reading through that code as it grows more and more. So what are the benefits of using Async-Await? So let's see the code. How does it execute in here? If we like refresh, we got should not do, and for the data prepared in here, basically we got all the data we need. Just like, a couple of usernames in here we're getting from the API, just a bunch of fake emails that you should not try to send any, hi or hello to, whatever. It doesn't, it works perfectly as expected to be. Now let's see why you should use Async-Await. Now for the should do, what we got, the same function does the same job with the same promises and everything. Now the other function in here we got, and this is where the magic gonna happen. We got fetch and prepare data, and this function is actually an asynchronous function. And this is where we are using Async-Await keywords. So for every function that you want to use Async-Await, you have to initialize the function as async. And if you remember, before, we didn't use a function, just put the code right to the module. Well, for that particular part, you can't. To use Async-Await, you have to initialize a function or create a function, and you make sure that you put async, beside that particular function, otherwise it won't work for you. So you will mark this as async, which means this one is going to take the full capabilities, the full potential of handling asynchronous code and making it look like synchronous, and it's going to handle promises as well. And in fact, this particular function, if you just go hover over it, it's clear to see it returns a promise. And that's all because we initialize this with async. Okay, it makes sense. Now the first thing we do is actually async. The second one is we can use await. And await is actually the beautiful thing that allows us to turn asynchronous code and, at least we make asynchronous code look like more synchronous code. So it's clear in here for response, we do Axios, we do get, the same URL, we got catch, we still got catch. We still can use catch, but you still can avoid using catch. So we got catch in here, and it got console log, error fetching. I don't know, I'm just gonna put in console there. My bad. Anyway, so we got console error fetching, and it's actually the same API. We don't have then as we did before. We don't have then we return whatever piece of data we want, then we can continue processing with that. We don't have that kind of thing. Instead, we got await. Now, what await does is actually gonna wait. From its name, it's await. So you're gonna wait on the promise to fulfill and finish. And since this Axios.get method returns a promise, so this await always gonna work with promises. It's gonna wait for that particular promise to, fulfill, to finish up whatever pending process they are doing. After it finishes up, it's gonna return that to the response. If it's successful, there's the response. Clearly in here has either void or Axios response. So if it's okay and it's successful on the request, we're going to get the response in here as Axios response. Otherwise, if there's an error, this catch method is going to be fired up and this response is going to become void. Okay, it's going to be void, it's going to be null, undefined, whatever you want to call it, but it's not going to have any kind of piece of data, and this particular method is going to fire up. Now, the second part in here we're going to have is actually we're going to check if the response, so which means if the response is actually valid, if it's not void, if anything kind of that kind of stuff, we're going to go response, then we're going to get another one. We're using actually pretty much another wait. So we're going to prepare data since it returns promises. So we're going to wait for that. So we're going to do response.data. We're going to do catch, and we just basically going to just do an error in here, and we're going to print the error for the catch as we did before. Now this prepared data is going to also be either void or whatever data we prepared in here. If any error is going to throw it up along the way, but otherwise if it's successful, this one is going to be successful. We're going to have await, and we're just going to check for await and going to console log this. And how does that look like? The code here is much easier to read through, and it's much simpler to read through. So this one looks more like synchronous code. It doesn't look any kind of stuff like asynchronous. No, it does look synchronous, and it does look really, really good. The other part that you can use stuff on is actually use try catch, which is the best of the two words that you can make your word, like much better. So try catch in here, and you can wrap it up, and it can become more like like synchronous code instead of asynchronous code. So we've got an error in here, we're gonna console log, and we can get rid of all of these catches. So this catch and this catch. Now there's no single callback on the code, like literally zero callback code and no function are being executed. So we got await, this one, if it's success, it's going to have response. If it's failed, it's going to go straight into the catch in here. It's going to do a console log, whatever handle you want to put, and everything is going to be working as expected to be. And how does that look like? It's much simpler, much cleaner to work like on that code. Look at it. It's literally less code than that, and it makes a lot of sense to work with. Now let's go ahead and see the results on both of these sides. So I got a port in here, got a port there, and let's go ahead and import that one, and I'm gonna refresh. So it should do, it's gonna take a couple of seconds, milliseconds. Look into the data, same one. So data prepared, look into it, got same email, some username, pretty much the same thing, it takes the same time, and it works the same way as expected to be. How cool is that? Async-Await, like in my opinion, and as the pro tip, well, you should just go for Async-Await and just completely avoid then and catch of using promises whenever you code on your code. So the last thing in here is console debugging. So we all use console.log or whatever console capability is available in JavaScript to debug and see what actually is going on behind the scenes of our code. So console.log is pretty much the most famous kind of line of code that pretty much everyone pretty much uses. Any JavaScript developer just goes through this and console logs whatever he stumbles upon to figure out what exactly is going on behind the scenes, so you can debug or understand how the code works or all the kind of stuff that console logging can be beneficial on. But there are two things that make console logging a bit easier for us, and it could just like make your life much easier, especially with long nested data types and nested data objects and arrays and big objects and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes console logging these into the console itself is going to be frustrating, and it's going to going to make it more complicated than it could solve the issue. So for should not do in here, what you should not do, what you can take for example in here is actually an array that already has some really nested objects. Because in here we got like an object inside of this array, and it has a couple of properties. Inside of this, another object, then another array, another object inside of those, and it just goes on and on. Sometimes you get a really long list of objects nested inside of each other's with arrays and data types and primitives and all the kind of stuff that makes it really complicated to just use console log. So usually for me and you as a regular JavaScript developer who just try to use the console log, all we do is actually go console.log data, and we just like pass in whatever data we get, either from like an HTTP request or from a response itself, or whatever that comes like read from a file or anything of that sort, especially a JSON base, because JavaScript really relies on JSON and XML, especially JSON. So you're going to find a lot of nested objects, and it's going to make it really ugly to look and find exactly what kind of property, for example, you're looking for. For example, you're going to look instead of topping, inside of that, like a type that's called sugar. Then if there's other properties in it, it's going to make it much more painful, and all that kind of awkward stuff that can happen to you when you use the console log. Now, what you should do in other case scenario, now for the should do in here, we got the same array, but what we're actually doing, instead of using console.log, we're using console.table. Now, this is a really useful method, and it's actually a new method in console here, and what it does, it basically like prints out arrays the perfect way it should be printed. It's not going to print it regularly as an object or something. It's going to print it at a table. So it's going to say console.table from its name. It's going to print the array as a table, and the properties are going to be like columns in the table, so you can clearly see what is going on behind the scenes. So let's go and see how does that look like. Now for should not do, this is what you get for the data, just when you use console.log. So if you do console.log, this is what happens. You go console.log, and this is basically you get a bunch of arrays and a bunch of objects nested inside of this particular array. You open it, you get inside of that, you go inside of another object, inside of another array, and inside of another object. Really painful. Look how does that look like. If you go inside of it even more, boom, really ugly, right? We got only 4 objects in here, and how does it look like anyway? It's pretty ugly, and it's pretty bad to look at it at the first glance. Now, how you can find stuff in this mess? The other hand, what you should do in the other hand is actually using console.table. As Cruising is interactive and uses kind of like, sorting in here, up and down sorting with indices, and all the kind of like properties that are available, like the array properties and the object properties. So you can just look at it and you can clearly see what is going on behind the scenes. And you even get these kind of objects. Of course, you won't be able to look on the objects. At least you get one of these, actually the data types that are being held inside of these particular properties. For example, betas, we got an object, and topping, we got an array of 7 for length, and you're gonna get the chance also to look on the array if you want to, which basically prints the same thing as a console log. So if you pretty much not gonna find it in the first place in here, in first kind of, I'm gonna say first depth of the array, of the objects array, well, you can go ahead and just use that. But I'm gonna say 99% is this console log table, the first nested depth log table in here, is gonna be beneficial for most developers, for most people, and they can clearly see what is going on behind the scenes. It's just 100% better than going and using console log. So console table, it's definitely next level to go ahead and use it for debugging a particular array. Now, the next one in here is actually debugging like how your code is performing. I know this is not really that much of interesting kind of feature that you want to just use. There's tools that you can use them, but one kind of cool feature in here, what it does is actually going to allow you, how is that? Let me just going to remove comments in here. So what it does allow you in here is actually you can do a timer. So you use console.time, you assign it a particular text in here, a particular label for it to know it. So you can call it timer 1. Then, for example, you do a loop for a length of 1,000,000. So we got 1,000,000 here as a number. So this one is going to take a couple of like milliseconds. I'm going to say take only a couple of milliseconds, not seconds or something. But let's say you've got some like asynchronous code that want to debug, or some process running out, or a worker, or anything of that sort, right? So what you can do is actually use the time in here. So you do time, you got a label first, then you got time end, and this one, it tells it like when the time is ended. So you start up the timer right here. For example, you initialize the timer and you start it up with this particular label. When you do time.end, this particular is going to end up the time in that particular millisecond. And what it does, you have to pass it the same label as it did before. And this one is going to like print the results to the SD out, which means it's going to print it to the console. That's basically what's going to be happening. Now, if you go back here, take a look, we got timer 1, and how many milliseconds it took? Like 4 milliseconds and a bunch of other stuff. Cool, right? If you refresh that, yeah, it depends on how how we process that kind of stuff, and how does it take it seriously, and how does it process all that kind of data. And this is a really good piece. Just go ahead and approach, and you see how performant your code is. And if you're not, finding bugs, like it takes really forever to load, or pretty much to like get the data done. Well, using something like this, I'm gonna tell you exactly what's going on behind the scenes. Plus, using console.table, you can tell what is going on. Also, if you've never like explored the console dots, then there's a bunch of functions and bunch of like methods nested in here, like counts, there's clear, assert, and you can do a lot of cool stuff with this. I'm pretty sure a lot of you guys don't explore that, just use console.log, as I do personally, but I do recommend going ahead and using the full capabilities that the console is actually providing for us as developers to debug it as the full potential. So, hope you guys enjoyed this one. Hope you guys enjoyed the JavaScript Pro tips for you guys. I know I just went through this a little bit deeply, but I just wanted you guys, everybody, like every single one of you, either beginner, intermediate, or that kind of more advanced people, to understand exactly what I'm saying and why I'm saying this particular point instead of that, and why you should use this instead of that. So why you should do this instead of should not do this, if you got the point. So that's basically what I tried to explain in this particular tutorial. Hope you guys enjoyed this as always. And if you like this kind of video tutorials where they just like pick up something and they give you like pro tips and what you do and what you should not and all that kind of stuff, let me know in the comment below. I'll be very happy to make more series and more technologies and more stuff to come in the next future. So hope you guys enjoyed this step before. Hope you guys all enjoyed it and catch you all hopefully in the next ones.